salutations, friends, and welcome to the Sunday sermon. I apologize as I don't look like I normally do, but I am back here at my mother's house for the final week of my crippled challenge, and I will be theoretically ambulatory in a week. So everybody better watch the fuck out, because I'm going to be able to move. So, yeah, those organ leads in that song are dope. That is our good friends, Lords of the Opium Church. They're from Edmonton, and they enjoy the Sunday sermon. And we're like, dude, we have this song. We think it would work pretty good. So yeah, I've been playing that at the beginning because they're cool guys, and it's a song about going to church. So I feel like it fits for our purposes. Oh, all right. So we're going to talk about the book of Revelation today. The craziest, most batshit fever dream ever written. This book changed the course of church history, no doubt about it. Like, this book is as hotly contested as most fought about. And many people really fucking care about your opinion of this book. There's a whole lot of dogma and stuff like that people don't necessarily care all that much about how you feel. How you feel about the book of Revelation, especially in Protestant circles. Catholics, it's a little less of a big deal, at least in my experience with them. But Protestants really fucking care how you interpret the book of Revelation and how that impacts the way you behave. They really care. And it's interesting because, as we'll find out today, that schism is, like most others that we figured out, politically motivated. I really can't stress that enough. That whenever you're looking at scripture and you're trying to understand why someone said what they said, why they wrote what they wrote, look at the politics. The politics will really help you understand why they did what they did and said what they said and wrote what they wrote. And for a group of people, the church, and I'm speaking non-denominationally here, for people that like to be involved in politics as much as the modern church has gotten, it's certainly very funny that they're very ignorant of the role that politics played in their development. So, keep that in mind. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this into a couple parts. We're going to talk about the actual book of Revelation, the book first, the history behind it, how it got written, why, when did it become accepted as text, and just kind of get, because I feel like you can't understand this book if you don't understand the background. So I'm going to give you the background first. We're going to do that first. Then we're going to look at the different ways this book is interpreted, because there's kind of like four big major interpretive branches of this book. We're going to look at those four and be like, oh, okay, so these people see it this way, these people see it this way. Break that down for you. Then we will look at the first two segments of the book, just get into it a little bit, and then that's where we will take our break so that we can come back next week and just dive headlong into the crazy stuff. But we will have a firm background of all that crazy stuff. So if that works for you, that works for me. If it doesn't work for you, sorry, because it's my Twitch channel, so it's going to have to work this way. So, something house built on sand? Yeah, buddy. We're going to try and make sure we actually understand what we're talking about here. So, alright, we've got our handy dandy aid. Space Dragon didn't even kick us off air. He must want me to talk about this crazy shit. So yeah, we're going to talk about the Book of Revelations. That was well timed. Yeah, it's the ancient fever dream your weird uncle won't shut up about. This book, I am always...
It's a big dog and it's taking a fat dog.
This book is one of those things that everybody has read. I feel like people who aren't even religious, they're just into apocalyptic literature, have read this book. Everybody's read this book that has any interest in the Bible at all. Even like a cursory academic interest, you've read this book. And everybody's got an opinion on it, and everybody's got an interpretation on it, and 90% of them are so off base. I'm not going to say anybody's wrong, because when talking about books of prophecy, it's rude to tell people that they're fucking idiots. Even though most of the people who are talking about this book are idiots. And I will prove that to you in some very simple things that I'm going to ask you to look at this objectively when I explain things to you about the book. Use your context clues, use your big boy brains, and you will understand that there's a pretty easy way to understand why this book was written and what the purpose of this book is. And it's probably not the end of the world. So, without further ado, let's take a look at this map. This is a map of the Aegean Sea. Why am I showing you a map of the Aegean Sea? I've talked about the book once, I'm an idiot. Yeah, talking about the book doesn't make you an idiot, but man, people that are idiots love to talk about this book. Alright, so the book was written by John of Patmos. That's what we know. That's it. So when people try to tell you, oh, the Apostle John wrote this book, there's absolutely no evidence of that. It was written by a guy who calls himself John of Patmos. First of all, his name probably wasn't fucking John. That is most likely an alias. That the reason he was on Patmos is he was in trouble. Patmos is where he was exiled. Where's Patmos, Riff? Patmos is right there. There you go. A little red star down there in the middle of the Aegean Sea. Tiny little island off the coast of Turkey. Yeah, he was there. He had been exiled there. So he wrote a book to his homies back in Turkey. There were 7 major churches there in Turkey. He wrote them a letter, and he called it The Revelations of God. He claims that God showed him this shit. You get to hang out in AC Odyssey? Maybe. That'd be kind of cool. Head out to the Isle of Patmos. So, yeah, to get this guy John, he's been exiled there. And he's sitting on Patmos, and he writes this letter, and somehow it really becomes just insanely popular, despite taking a while to get popular. This was a slow burn. Slow burn. Best estimates date the book around 95 CE, during the reign of Domitian. Now, Domitian was an emperor who came into power during a very turbulent time, and he ruled from 81 to 96 CE. We believe this book was written at the very tail end of his reign. He had seen both his father and his brother die as emperor. It was not, it didn't really go well for them. So he decided that a way to ensure that he lasted a little longer was he reinstituted the idea of the cult of personality towards the emperor. He reinstituted the idea that the emperor was the son of Jupiter, and therefore that he ruled by divine right. So Christians obviously had issues with this, and this led to a whole lot of back and forth. Again, Domitian never outlawed Christianity, anything like that. He didn't do that. He just more enhanced all the protocols of observance to Roman religion in everyday life. And this was minimal stuff. Not being an asshole, that actually was against the job description for being Emperor of Rome. You literally, first line, act like an entitled dick. And so, you can't follow the job description. You're not going to have the job for very long. And even when you do have the job description, if you do it too well, then you don't have the job for very long. So yeah, he wanted to kind of reintroduce the idea that he had a divine mandate to rule, hoping that would help him last a little longer. He had just been installed by the Praetorian Guard, who had been responsible for helping take out his brother, Titus. So shit was a little wild with him. So, one of his big things was that all food in Rome was offered to him, metaphorically speaking, before it was offered to your guests at your home or your party. Think of it as saying grace over your food. This created a huge loggerhead with the Christians because the Christians considered that offering the food to an idol. And in the Old Testament, there had been some very specific statements about not eating food that was offered to idols first. So the Christians decided that getting along was not something that they could do. So they made big scenes out of refusing to eat the food that had been offered to the emperor first, through prayer or whatever. So they were constantly making big scenes about, oh, I can't eat that food. And that was, of course, spitting in the face of the emperor, which created persecution, which the Christian writers then were able to spin as being persecuted for their faith. Let me be very clear. There is zero evidence that he actually gave any shits about the religious leanings of these people. What he gave shits about was them refusing to participate in decorum that acknowledged his power as the emperor. Again, Christians love to spin this that they were being persecuted so harshly because of their love of God. They were more being persecuted, again, not even as harshly as they would like to sell it, but they were being persecuted because they were acting like dicks and being rude. They were refusing to participate in regular society. They were, again, it's kind of funny. Christians don't want to make accommodations for anybody now. They were the OG. We need accommodations because I can't do that because it violates my religion. They were doing this shit OG and causing problems. Yeah, Christians with a persecution complex? Never. It was the most hotly debated book in the Bible. What I mean by that is when around the first century, around the end of the first century, people had started to put together collections of what texts were considered good shit. This routinely got left out after it was written. And even about 100 years after it was written, most people still did not include this in what they considered their, list of text for the Bible. They didn't want anything to do with this book. They thought this book was nuts. John Calvin, who we talked about, shaped Protestant faith as much as any. This is very interesting to me. I didn't know this before I started researching all this. John Calvin wrote a commentary on every book in the Bible except for Revelations because he didn't deem it worth it. Yet, Protestants, of course the people most influenced by John Calvin's teachings, love the book of Revelation. Martin Luther, for most of his career, considered the book worthless and did not talk about it. It was only later in life that he reversed that policy and saw the book as having some merit. Most of his life, he found the book worthless and meritless. There are still the Church of the East, as we've talked about. One of the early split-offs from the Catholic Church, they still do not recognize this book. They consider this book more of a personal letter, not actual dogma. And it's certainly to them not considered prophecy. So, very interesting, but yeah, still a whole lot of people that think this book is silly and not worth your time. Probably because it's nuts. So who is this John character that wrote this book? We know nothing about him other than his name is John of Patmos. Some people have tried to say he's John the Apostle. When you compare the linguistic styles between the books, there's almost no way that this guy and the other John wrote the same book. There's other people that claim he was a different apostle or that he was one of the first apostles that came after Jesus died. You have to remember, this book was written in 95. So if this guy was alive 60 some years earlier when Jesus was killed, this guy would have been a child. So again, it doesn't make sense that anybody that really knew Jesus wrote this book. This guy would clearly have been a Greek Christian who would have come after Jesus had already died. So this guy would have been a member of the very early church. John, don't eat those mushrooms growing on Patmos, buddy. Don't eat those. Yeah, so there you go. And John is very likely an alias because, again, as we're going to talk about, this book, if you really read it, it reads just as much like Dante's Inferno as it does like an actual book of prophecy. This is a political hit piece there is a lot of fuck yous to a lot of powerful people in here, you generally do that under an alias, or at least make it not super obvious who did it. So, John, it was just his bullshit of a common name then as it was now. So, like, hey, I'm John. On this island, I wrote this. Patmos was just a tiny little island. They sent you there when they didn't want to kill you, but you were being a pain in the ass. Now, why wouldn't they just kill you? Doesn't that seem easier? Because the Romans had a very strict sense of decorum and justice, and as ridiculous and as brutal as their justice system could be at times, they followed it to the T. Even though it would have been much more convenient to just kill this asshole, if what he was accused of was not a crime worthy of death, they weren't going to kill him. And yes and yes, Grizz, yes. But yeah, it very likely this John who wrote the Book of Revelation, he fancied himself a prophet, and so he probably had been prophesying about other shit that would have annoyed the Roman locals, who would have said, "Hey, that's a form of black magic because it's not our religion and he's not prophesying through our gods." One of the punishments for that was banishment. And again, I think this illustrates that the persecution maybe being a little bit overblown. Why wouldn't they just execute him if they were coming down so hard on, this new religion? Instead, they exiled the guy and let him write this insanely famous book. It's, again, the persecution stories are all there, but when you really start looking for facts and the mechanics to support them, it really never comes together. Tertullian. This, if you've never heard of this guy, we will talk more about him in later episodes should this series continue. If the sermons go to season 3, yeah, we're going to have to talk about this lunatic. Tertullian is really interesting because he, I feel like, had such a dramatic influence on the church, yet he is not canonized, he's not a saint, and he's not even listed among the fathers of the church, because some of the stuff that he wrote is now considered heretical, even though at the time that he wrote it, it was considered like brilliant thought. He also loved to write history that was almost completely fabricated. You often find accounts of his linked with peers like Pliny the Elder and guys like that we know are famous for, some of the history that they've written. And some of the stuff that he writes mirrors some of their accounts, but his always have a very Christian bent towards them, and they often color details that he writes very colorfully, let's put it that way. One of the things that he stated about this book was that John had actually been attempted to be killed by the emperor several times, and that they could not do it. So, including, he has this whole story about them boiling this man in oil, and he still won't die. So, in his idea, they did want to kill John, but they couldn't. So, their response was to exile him to Patmos since they couldn't kill him. Nobody else mentions that, because clearly that didn't happen. Had they boiled him in oil, he would have just been boiled in oil. But it makes the story seem oh so much more magical to say, oh, the reason they exiled the guy is because they couldn't kill him, not the reason they exiled the guy is because they didn't believe what he did was worthy of the death penalty, because they're really not as bad as we're making them out to be. Again, nuance, folks. Nuance. And and what's the point, you say? The point is the interpretation of the author's message is as varied as Christianity itself. Depending on what church you walk into, you could get about 1 million ideas about this book. The most common ones are preterist, futurist, historicist, or idealist. So those are kind of the 4 ways you can look at this book. So, what is a preterist? They're split between full and partial preterists. They believe that the Bible, everything in the book of Revelation, has already happened. That's a full preterist. A partial preterist believes that everything except for the second coming at the very end has already happened. But that, like, all of this whole, the age of the church and all that, they believe that that already happened. And that basically, when the author, our buddy John of Patmos, says, I'm talking about the things that will come hereafter, he literally means, like, right now. Like, starting when he wrote this book, the age of the church started. People that are preterists tend to love to predict the end of the world because they use the math of the book of Revelation, some of which we will get into next week, to try to say, oh, well, the book says that there'll be 1,000-year reign, so if you say the reign started here, then it ends 1,000 years later, this is going to be when the world ends. There was even a whole movement of these people called Millerists, because this guy, George Miller, believed that he had figured out when the world would end. And there was the great disappointment when all of his people, I want to say it was in like 1916 or something, were convinced the world was going to end. And it did not. And they all looked really stupid. And often those people, they always just go, oh, I just had a math error. It's like the guys from Parks and Recreation who every year book the party for when the dragon's going to come back and destroy the world. And every year they just go, oh, we did the text wrong. It's actually next year. That's what these people do. It's the same thing. Futurists, they believe that the prophecies of Daniel, Ezekiel, and the book of Revelations, that they all tie together and that none of them have happened yet. They also have a big dispute over the tribulation. A, what is it? And B, when does the rapture happen? I would say that just about everybody listening today probably has heard of the rapture in some way, shape, or form. Cliff's Notes version, it's when Jesus takes all his people out of the earth and then pours down wrath upon the earth. Well, some people think before the whole tribulation starts, that's when the rapture happened. Everybody goes. Some people believe that it's halfway through. The tribulation is supposed to last 7 years. Some people believe that 3.5 years through, at the midway point, that's when the believers come home and then shit goes sideways. Other people believe that believers will be here all the way and that the rapture is the signal that God's on the way back. Which seems weird to call us up there to then come back right away. But hey, what do I know? That's just what they go with. The idealist believes that the book of Revelation is a symbolic work, meant to challenge Christians to persevere and instill hope that their faith will be rewarded. This was the initial view of the text and has maintained a consistent following of people who interpret the text this way since the text was written. This is the oldest and, for most of recorded history, the most common view. I really think we need to stress that. This was the most common view, was that the whole thing was just a story. It was a metaphor. The futurists didn't actually really become a belief until the 19th century. And the preterists had been, I want to say they happened around, probably around 600, 700 AD is when people started interpreting it that way. And then you have the historicists. They believe the book of Revelation to be a symbolic presentation of the church's history, and that its prophecies are fulfilled by events like the Reformation, the Revolution, whatnot. Historicists also goes all the way back to St. Augustine believed in the historicist view. A lot of people go with this one. This one also goes all the way back to as soon as we started talking about this text, the historicist view was how people saw this. And that I really think that's important to keep in mind. The kind of the age of when we thought about these. So let's take just a minute here and talk about why those views matter. The idealist was the earliest and the most common. That it was just a metaphor, that it was just a story. That is really the most, in my opinion, the most accurate view is that one. Then, something happened. We may have talked about it, and you will see the method to my madness with the way these have all been structured. There was this little thing called the Reformation. One of the things that the Reformation really jump-started was the idea, Martin Luther really championed it, of the they called it the historicist reformed view of Revelations. And get this one because it's really good. Martin Luther reads Revelation. He comes around on it now. Earlier in his young career as a Catholic priest, he didn't like the book. All of a sudden he goes, wait, I now have a new understanding of this book. The Pope is the Antichrist, and Little Horn, the demon with the dragon with the horns that's going to destroy everyone, that's the Catholic Church. And I have to split off from the Catholic Church, and this book tells me so. So all of a sudden, this book that he didn't like had a way to justify this giant schism that was happening. He was then, all of a sudden, he's all for it. And that became the view of almost all Protestants. They joined in on the historicist view that the book of Revelation was clearly referring to the Catholic Church as the great evil, the great Babylon, the whore of Babylon, that the church had turned its back on God's teachings, and because of that, they had to split away from them because destruction was coming and God was going to bring down the church, and that the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, that was a sign. The French Revolution, that was a sign. The problem with the historicists, one of the biggest ones, is that they were constantly retconning their story. Every time a big tumultuous world event happened, you would have somebody who would find a way to plug a prophecy, and think of it like Nostradamus. Every time something big happens in the world scene, you have some jagoff on the History Channel 3 days later telling you that Nostradamus wrote about this in this one quatrain that he did. This is the same thing that the historicists do. Every time some big crazy world thing happens, they would find a book in Revelation and say, see, this confirms. So naturally, the Catholics, they can't get down with this. This is not good. These guys are using their own book against them. They're saying that, the Pope's being called the Antichrist. This is not a great PR move for them. So that is why the Catholic Church invented the futurist belief. 2 Jesuit priests came up with the idea to combat the idea that the Pope was the Antichrist and that all of this, had already happened. Their idea was, no, none of it happened. And the Pope isn't the Antichrist. The Antichrist is going to be a politician. And that's why you can't trust politicians and you can't trust the government. Only Mother Church can protect you. And that was pretty effective at scaring the shit out of people. Telling them that all this horrific stuff wasn't metaphorical, that this was real, and that it was going to happen. And that, again, if you follow the church, you won't be here for it because you'll get raptured. You won't have to be here for when that happens. So they sold some fear, and apparently somewhere around the 20th century, the Protestants caught on that this selling fear is really effective, and that if they sold their own fear, they could make lots of money too. And you saw that a lot of Protestant churches began to switch their interpretation to a futurist interpretation as well, because fear sells. So, now that we have an idea of of what the fuck we're talking about here, I want to explain the breakdown of the book. The Book of Revelation is structured in 3 ways, and futurists especially will tell you that the 3 ways are what has passed, what is happening now, and what will happen in the future. And they believe that the way the book is broken down is that the first chapter is basically the past. The first chapter is kind of boring. We just get introduced to John of Patmos. He says, hey, I'm on this island, and a voice that sounds like a trumpet said, yo, I'm going to show you some shit. The second chapter and third chapter, which we consider, people who are futurists would consider the now, that is the airing of the grievances. It becomes like Festivus. There are 7 churches in Turkey that John feels the need, well, he's told by God, he needs to call these 7 churches out. He needs to spill the tea and write them a letter and tell them to get their shit together. And so he does, and he calls out each one of these churches individually, most of them with a, hey, you're doing this good, and I'm proud of you, but you're fucking this up, get your shit together. And he does that for all 7 of these churches. Then in chapter 4 is when he takes the peyote, and things go off the rails. And he includes all that in his letter. which I imagine had to be pretty jarring, because let's say you got this as a letter. It's like, oh, hey, I'm stuck on Patmos. This kind of sucks. God told me he wanted me to say some shit to you. Here's some stuff you and your buddies need to get your shit together on. Oh, by the way, crazy town. So that had to be really fucking intense. Like, you're reading this book, it's like, oh, yeah, we were doing that. We should probably knock that off. Yeah, oh, man, John's all the way around Patmos, and he heard about this shit we were doing. Must have been God that told him. What a minute, what the fuck is he talking about? That had to be how reading that letter went. Because there's just no other way to read something this insane that someone sends you. So. There we go. So. We've got our little map here. As you see, Patmos is circled down there in purple. And the first church that he writes a letter to is Ephesus. He tells the homies at Ephesus he needs to talk. They're the first church that gets mentioned by him in his book. So he calls to Ephesus. He says, look, I gotta talk to you first. He accuses them of having lost their zeal for the Lord's work. He basically says, hey, when this all started, you guys were hot shit. You were going out there. You were fishing for men, as God loves you to talk about. They were recruiting new converts. But now, and especially, they're not focused on charity. Ephesus, very wealthy port city. A lot of the people involved in this church would have had money. And apparently, not enough of that was trickling down into the poor tray. And John makes sure he lets them know about that. They're complimented for their rejection of false prophets and for being sound on gospel teachings. This is a very interesting one. The Nicolaitans were taught by a Christian at the time named Nicholas. I know, very, very creative name, so I apologize for that there. He taught, basically, he's accused of teaching Christians to just be totally indulgent and to live this hedonistic lifestyle and all this stuff. That's a bit debatable. What he is mainly known as having taught them is that it was okay to eat the food that had been offered to idols, especially in the face of persecution. So basically, Nicolaitans are people that wanted to just get along and participate in society on normal levels, but also be Christians. John makes it very clear that he hates them. According to him, God hates them too. And so the fact that the church at Ephesus rejected these people, he was into. So that's the first one that he mentions. Then we get to Smyrna. He writes them a letter. He's got some things to say to them. He commends them for their dedication despite their persecution. There was a large Jewish population in Smyrna. There is some theory that, yeah, Nicholas was actually, by all accounts, he seems like a pretty decent guy. His big thing was, hey, don't make waves. That was his big thing. But yeah, there is some reason to believe that the large Jewish population, especially the leaders of the synagogue there in Smyrna, would have been antagonistic towards the early Christians. So the ones in Smyrna are commended, because basically what the Jews would go do is the Jews would go to the Romans and say, hey, these guys are causing dissent in the Jewish community. And the Romans didn't really care what the Jewish community did as long as it wasn't infighting, because again, infighting leads to outfighting, which leads to revolution, and the Romans didn't have time for that shit. So that's what that was. They are reminded explicitly that suffering on earth pales in comparison to eternal life. So John just tells them, yeah, it sucks, but keep on keeping on. It's all going to be worth it in the end. Next was the church at Pergamum. They are commended for their obedience and dedication despite a strong pagan influence in the city. This city had a lot of temples to just about every god ever. This was very common in port cities and cities that had a lot of trade. People brought their religious views in, and in Pergamum, everybody's religious views were respected. What a horrible idea. He did warn them about falling victim to the tactics of Balaam. Does anybody remember what the tactics of Balaam are? We went over this earlier this season. The tactics of Balaam, if you'll recall, is to link up Christians with non-believers and get them to hook up together.
That's a big dog and it's taking a fat dog.
I wish it was getting high. No, it was having sexual relations with non-believers, because the idea is that, if your girlfriend is not a Christian and you are, eventually she'll convince you not to be a Christian too. She'll convince you to worship whatever god she's worshiping. And so John is warning them that, hey, there's a lot of pagans in that city. Don't you go dating them and ending up marrying them, and then you're going to have, they're going to lead you astray. That's his big worry. Thyatira is the next city on our list. They're part of the letter. They're commended for growing, but chastised for tolerating a Jezebel. The woman he refers to is not actually named Jezebel. We don't know what her name was. We do know that she was a prophetess of a different religion, and that she basically tried to teach that Christianity didn't have to be completely incompatible with pagans. I know, what a rotten bitch. See, Pale, you dragged her down to our level. John also makes a statement that essentially claims retributive providence is confirmed. He basically says at the end of his letter to the Thyatiran church that that's what it is, Chris. He basically says that, no. He basically says, that you get what you deserve. And that if things are going bad for them, it's probably because they were tolerating this chick. He makes the claim that you're getting what you deserve. Next on to Sardis. Now, here he gets very historical. Sardis had been the victim, historically, of a couple surprise attacks that had devastated the city. John here references those and says, hey, remember those? That could happen to you metaphorically as a church too. If you're not vigilant and know that people are out to get you, you could be crushed. We could lose our church. They're also accused of being physically alive, but spiritually dead. Sardis was another very wealthy area. I think that's a very common thing about these 7 churches he calls out, is almost all of them would have had wealth and power in some of their congregants. So I think you can't overstate that. That's one of the things he's calling them out, is like, hey, you guys have means, you need to be using those means to help us grow the church. And if you're not, you're fucking up. Again, as you're noticing, nothing here is talking about the end of the world. This is an admonition. What I find very interesting is we have no historical basis to back up. Did John know people at all 7 of these churches, and that's where he's got this insider information? Is he just, for all you know, this could be the manifesto of a crazy person that has never even met those other people, and he's just calling them out on random shit. We have no idea. But I find that part really interesting, that for all we know, this could be a letter to the editor, and somehow it's become the most studied text in the Bible. And it might have been a crazy man yelling at a cloud. It very much could have been that. Next, move on to Philadelphia. The city so shitty it started in Turkey. These Christians had stayed faithful despite persecution from a large synagogue in the city. Same thing that was going on, in Thyatira. The Jews there didn't like them. This one receives no rebuke. Its adversaries are told, you continue to fuck with this church, you're going to get it. And also God says they'll never win a Stanley Cup again. It's in there. You just have to look really hard to see it. Laodicea. A fun word to say, for sure. That is just so many vowels in one little word. I'm always impressed with it. This church is accused of being lukewarm. They're not hot, they're not cold, they're just sort of interested. So much, which is so disgusting that he spits them out from his mouth. It is a very graphic metaphor. He's really annoyed with these guys. They're accused of letting their economic prosperity influence their core values in a negative fashion. I mean, again, what did I say? He once again is mentioning money. that these wealthy Christians are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And can we talk about, for just a minute, the fact that if there is one part of this book that is absolutely never analyzed, never commented on, never seems to be the key bit, it is that he tells all 7 of these churches, you have money and you're not using it to help the poor, what fucking gives? That's exactly what it is, Grizz. This first 3 chapters are very specific, so nobody ever talks about those. When you hear people talk about Revelations, what they're talking about is chapter 4 through chapter 22. That's where all the crazy stuff happens. Yet, the very first part here is a very clear and concise admonition to the early church to remember the first rule of Christianity. Love the Lord your God. And there was number 2, love your neighbor as much as you love God. That is the rules. And part of that involves taking care of the poor, taking care of the sick, taking care of widows, orphans, all that stuff. And he very clearly calls out all 7 churches and say, hey, don't forget to stick to the core message, the core thing, which is being good to each other. Don't lose sight of that. He says that to all of them. And today, what is the thing that we immediately gloss over, that we immediately make sure has no part in our church? We don't talk about this. We are way too busy, instead having fun with, let's talk about all the crazy stuff. Let's skip over the really tangible message that we could all live and do right now. That has always yeah, GOPesus is not happy. So that's where we're at now. So, what's happened? He's gone on, he's talked to everybody, he's told them, the deal. He's told them what he expects. American Jesus plays in the distance. He's told them what he expects. That, to a futurist, that is the part of the book that is in the past. Everything now that he's about to talk about is deep in the distant future. And so what happens is now he's had, he's dictated his letter. He's told those churches what God wants him to tell those churches. Now, he is told, come and you're going to come up to heaven. And he sees this guy, and the guy shows up with a sword sticking out of his mouth and burnished bronze features. For anybody that's ever seen burnished brass before, it does not look white. This was probably not a white guy that he saw. Who has shock white hair and a white robe and a golden girdle. This dude looks pretty dope, and he's got stars in his hand. And he tells them, these stars are the keys to the universe, and I'm going to, naturally he has 7 stars, which sort of corresponds to the 7 churches. He's telling the churches, that God's got them in his hand. He's aware of them. He knows about them. But he tells them it's time. It does sound like a singer for a power metal band. The voice like a trumpet. So then he tells them, hey, come with me. I got some shit to show you. So they head up to heaven, and shit gets wild. After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. And now get ready for Matt Pike's favorite part of the Bible. Around the throne were 24 thrones. In the original text, he says 4 and 20 thrones, so we're going to read it that way because it's more fun. And seated on the thrones were 4 and 20 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal. Around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. So, let's take a minute and paint that scene. So he walks through this portal. I kind of like to think of it as like, like a teleportal kind of thing, like a little doorway you go through and you're in another dimension. He's in heaven now. This huge glowing dude is sitting on a throne with a rainbow around it, made from the most precious of gems, crystal glass everywhere. And our old buddies, the seraphims, the pure nightmare fuel, 4-faced, 6-winged, eyeball-covered abominations, are flying around this dude's head, screaming, Holy, 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 the Lord God is Almighty. And they're giving him the Bret the Hitman Hart treatment. They're saying he is who was, who is, and who will be. That's how dope this guy is. He invented Bret Hart's signature phrase. That's how cool this guy is. So, we've got the Hitman, Jesus Christ, sitting on the throne. He's got these ridiculous looking monster angels flying around him. And it's all a little bit much for our buddy John. He hits the deck because he just... Do we really blame the guy? This is really intense. And that is where we're going to stop. Bret Hart invented it. Jesus Christ just co-opted. So he is in heaven now. And all this crazy shit is about to go down. And what happens is one of my favorite literary parts of the book because it makes so little sense. He says there is this book that this one angel rolls in carrying, and it's a huge book. And the book has 7 seals on it. And no one can break the seals. No one is strong enough to break them. In fact, no one is even strong enough to look at them. So I don't know how he knows that there were 7 seals on this book if no one is strong enough to even look at them, because he also previously states that he looked at it. So, very confusing, but there's a book. And that book has the 7 seals. And as those seals are broken, things will happen that will jumpstart the end of the world. And that will lead to 7 trumpets being played and 7 bowls of God's wrath being poured out on the earth. And then the arrival of the 4 horsemen, the arrival of the whore of Babylon riding a dragon, the locust people, they're all coming. And all of them probably mean metaphorical things. And that's what we're going to do next week. So we are going to dive into this fever dream. We are going to get waist deep in the crazy. And we are going to figure out what the hell did this guy see? And is there any way to metaphorically explain it? Because at this point, you really have to take one of 3 beliefs. Either this was all a metaphor, and that if we look at the historical context, we can figure out what he was trying to say to people back then. We can say this was all a fever dream, and it was just, he ate some bad mushrooms and had a little trip to Crazy Town. Or we can say this was the divine inspiration of God and that all of that shit was prophetic. Since that seems a little less likely, and the idea that he just hallucinated gives us nothing to do, we're going to assume the position that has been the position of the church since day one, that this is all a metaphor. And let's see if we can unravel the metaphor. So I hope you come back and join us next week when we unravel the metaphor, now that we understand the political ramifications of this book. He got sent to an island for doing prophecy, so what did he do? He did more prophecy on the island. And sure enough, his prophecy talks about the destruction of a ruling power. So maybe, just maybe, he's mad about being exiled on the island, and he writes a book about the destruction of the Roman Empire and uses metaphors to call them Babylon, because writing, hey Rome, you're fucked, was probably going to get somebody to come out to the island and kill him, and he clearly wasn't into that either. So, a little common sense, folks. This isn't about the end of the world. This is a fuck you from a guy who's mad that he's sitting on an island by himself. And we're going to read his rather epic fuck you next week. It's going to be a blast. But now you've got the backstory. You know what this book is about. And if nothing else, I think what we can really focus on was what was told to those first churches in the airing of the grievances. What's really important is to take care of other people. Take care of the sick, take care of the poor, take care of the needy, people who are hurting, comfort them. That is the mission. And I know we all have fun here and we have some laughs. But let's be honest. We're all also here because we kind of want to stick it to Christians just a little bit. Well, I tell you what, there's no better way to stick it to them to be better at their game than they are. So they're supposed to be out there loving and all that other stuff, and we can spend all day talking about how they missed the message. But you know it's the best FU? To be out there doing it ourselves. To be out there being the example that they should be. Because then we can say whatever the fuck we want. Because at the end of the day, we're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if they're right, and we get to the afterlife, and we have to answer for the way we lived our lives, we can say, hey, your rule was to be nice to other people. And I'd say I did a pretty good job of that. I think they will be surprised at the response you get should any of that actually be possible. So thank you so much for being here this week. We might do next week with me dancing the whole time if that's possible, because I'm so glad you're here and I really enjoy talking about this book. It's going to be crazy next week. And I also think that the message is good, and we've all been missing the message. Everybody wants to talk about the end of the world. Nobody wants to talk about what you do before the end of the world, which is be a good person and take care of people. So go forth, take care of each other. I will be moved. I am going to go full Shamgar on somebody next week. I'm going to get an ox goad instead of a cane. It's going to be dope. But have a good week, everyone. Be good to each other. We will be back on Wednesday with Real Scary. I've got a doozy. We're not voting this week. I've already got a movie we're going to watch. And we're going to have some fun. Thanks so much for being here. Go out there. Do something good for somebody today. Because you should. Not for any other reason. Do